to a group called the Duty to Warn, which is a group of psychiatrists and psychologists who feel we have the right and the obligation to speak out about Trump's psyche when it endangers the country and the world. And what we're seeing, you mentioned the potential unraveling of the pact with Iran. There's also the potential unraveling of Donald Trump, which seems to be occurring. It's hard to read him because his behavior, as I understand it, is completely solipsistic. He sees the world through his own sense of self, what he needs and what he feels, and he couldn't be more erratic or scattered or dangerous. So the exchange with North Korea has to be terrifying to all of us. It's not something that can be controlled. You have two leaders who are bent on hyperbole and intense threat to the other and have their own motivations, each of which is hard for us to read. But we can read the danger that they represent, particularly since we've learned recently that Trump is on record for demanding something like 10 times the number of nuclear weapons. And that's what I call extreme nuclearism, a kind of embrace of the weapons to do everything that they can't do. The only thing nuclear weapons can do is destroy countries, cities, destroy human beings. But since they came into being, there's been an impulse to embrace them and see them as saviors, prevent war, keep the world going, maintain authority on the part of the nuclear weapons possessing nations. So Trump is into that extreme nuclearism. And at the same time, as you mentioned, with the other apocalyptic twin, the terrible and very real threat of climate change, global warming, he and his followers are blocking every reasonable effect that was put forward at Paris in 2015, and through which the world seeks to confront what may be the gravest danger it's ever faced. That's where we are.
I mean, to go back to what you said initially, the group that you're a part of, the psychiatric group, you're a contributor to a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. What are some of the key concerns about Trump that you and your colleagues raise?
Well, I wrote a letter together with Judith Herman to the New York Times in which we raised two issues. One was his relation to reality, which is, I would say, solipsistic and untenable and very dangerous to everyone.
What do you mean solipsistic?
Solipsistic from within the self. In other words, he only sees the world from within his sense of self. He can't have empathy for others. He can't really think into the future, the consequences of his actions, because he's totally preoccupied with the immediate event and how he can deal with it or manipulate it as emerging through the perception on the part of his sense of self. That's very extreme. People who are psychotic behave that way, and yet for the most part, Trump is not psychotic. That combination makes him really dangerous. So that relationship to reality is one thing. And the other thing that Judith Herman and I wrote about was his difficulty with crises and his extreme behavior and attack mode instead of any kind of balance which a president needs to deal with a crisis. So those were two. And in this regard, I write about what we call malignant normality. So he's the president. A president takes actions. There's a tendency to normalize them because, after all, he is the president. He's in charge. When what is called normality is completely malignant and harmful. And I came to that idea through work on Nazi doctors. They were expected to reverse healing and killing and really take the lead in killing in Auschwitz. I'm not accusing any Americans of being Nazi doctors. I'm saying that this is a model of malignant normality, and we now face it with Trump and his administration.
I wanted to ask you about your group, Duty to Warn. Vanity Fair has a piece where Steve Bannon, the disgraced White House aide, said he told President Trump that his concern should be the 25th Amendment. Not being impeached, but the cabinet voting him out. He says something like Trump has a 30% chance of making it through his term. You are a psychiatrist. Can you talk further about what it would take, if it wasn't an impeachable crime, to remove President Trump, why you believe he is a danger right now?
It's unclear whether or how Trump will be removed from or resigned from the presidency before the completion of his term. One doesn't know that. It will probably, in my judgment, be a political rather than a psychological act. I mean, one could take the 25th Amendment, and his cabinet and vice president could attest to his unfitness for being president.
But the cabinet are his appointees.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very likely, does it? But rather, what's happening now is that there's a dialogue between this psychiatric group and Congress people in which we are bringing information about Trump's unfitness, which becomes part of the political dialogue. It will probably
Are you talking to Congress members?
Yes. People from this group are talking to Congress people. And it will probably be a political decision that removes Trump, and that means an election process and the issue of whether you get a Democratic House or Senate and other political issues that will become very important. But this is now part of the dialogue. Everybody knew that Trump was bizarre, strange, was unreliable, unfit to be president. It's been known by the hypocritical Republicans for a very long time. But putting it forward by psychologists and psychiatrists gives it a certain greater authority and becomes part of that dialogue and recognition. That's the way that I see it, rather than a clear-cut removal through the 25th Amendment. Though one doesn't know, because there's more and more evidence about Trump's campaign's collusion in Russia and potentially about obstruction of justice, and all these could play a part. He could attempt to fire Mueller, as he's threatened to do, and that could bring about a constitutional crisis. So we don't know. We can't predict what process will occur. The psychological now is in dialogue with the political on the president, any president, but especially Trump, on his capacity to initiate a nuclear war. Any restriction on that is profoundly desirable. It's a strange world, to say the least, when the generals are there to restrain the civilian. The generals aren't, on the whole, known for their military restraint. There are exceptions. With the Vietnam War, as you know, it was initiated by civilians, the best and the brightest, as it was called. The military was at first a little reluctant, then entered it and became corrupted by it, and created what I came to call atrocity-producing situations. That could happen here, too, with the generals who are ostensibly restrainers, allowing him, being unable to prevent him from initiating some form of war, being themselves drawn in and then corrupted by it. That's a really dangerous sequence. Anything that holds that back or in check is desirable.
This year, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Do you see that as significant?
I do see that as very significant because there is a mindset that rejects nuclearism. Nuclearism is the embrace of weapons to, as I said before, to do all the things they can't do and to utilize them instead of what should be utilized in the way of peacemaking. So giving the Nobel Peace Prize to a group that seeks to outlaw all nuclear weapons recognizes that mindset, the critical mindset toward nuclear weapons. And, you know, I was part of the anti-nuclear movement, still am, but particularly the doctor's role in anti-nuclear work. And I think we have reason to believe that the whole anti-nuclear movement from all directions was a significant factor in preventing the use of nuclear weapons since Nagasaki in 1945. It doesn't mean that we're on fine ground with nuclear weapons. It's still extremely dangerous, as we're discussing. But the prevention of their use was certainly influenced by anti-nuclear movements and a rejection of nuclearism. Have a special form of witness. And many of them, including particularly Hiroshima survivors, as you know, so-called hibakusha, have traveled around the world and told their stories. And that does us a service, and it does them a service as well, because it gives meaning to an otherwise intolerable kind of experience.